Let me just start a little bit. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, because some of you I know, some of you I haven't had an opportunity to get to know. My name is Mau, and I've been in ministry now for over 20 years. Employed ministry, but I've been serving in the Samoan churches, doing ministry since I was just a little wee taka. And I'm a fifth generation Adventist. I love this church. Is the church perfect? No. But do I love it? Absolutely I do. Am I loyal to it? Absolutely I am. Do I think that there are things that we can do better? Absolutely I do. That I think we got to keep pushing ourselves, keep pushing our family to do the best that we can. So I'm absolutely glad that my wife can join me here, Lepeta. This is... Let me tell you a little bit about our family. My daughter there, Rachel, in her first year in La Trobe, studying law and business. So she's enjoying that, and she would have loved to have been here, but she has other commitments back at Gilson College. My wife is a primary teacher at Gilson College, and she works with the lower, the year twos and year ones in foundation classes there. And of course, I've been in ministry now for quite a number of years, and I'll tell you a little bit about that journey very shortly. This is some of my extended family. It was just this week that I had a really tough day. You know, for all of you who have lost a loved one, it was on Thursday. A year ago, my dad passed away. And I was at college doing stuff, and when I got that phone call, it was unexpected. It really messed me up. And yeah, absolutely, I have, just like you, this incredible hope. But it doesn't take away the pain, as Jesus wept when one of his dear family members passed away. The same with all of us. And so to be able to celebrate that with my dad there, to remember a year closer to meeting up with him again on that resurrection morning. A year closer when we get to travel together through the galaxies and be. So this is some of my family, some of the Mariner family on my mother's side, and on my father's side is the Johnsons and the Tuaois, one of the gathering together. So that's the extended family. Ethnicity, I'm Samoan, proud of it. But that's my ethnicity. My culture at the moment is Australian, and but my identity is Christ Jesus. And I think it's really important for us to remember that. Remember what we are. My ethnicity, I'm Samoan. I was born a Samoan. You can see, there's no way I'm going to be able to change my color. But my culture is now here in Australia, and I'm an Australian citizen, and a New Zealand citizen, and a citizen of any other country that will give it to me. But I'm proud of that. But my identity will never change, and that is Jesus Christ. And I hope that that's the same for all of you as you wander through your different ethnicity. So, born in Samoa, grew up in South New Zealand. We call it in Christchurch the mainland, and that's certainly the Canterbury Plains where we grew up. And if you know the Crusaders, yeah. You'll know where I'm from, and being our team, and of course our national team, the ABs, who feel sorry for the French at the moment. Ministry. We trained at Avondale College, and we graduated there in 97, came out, and they took me back to the very same conference that I grew up in. You know, they say that a prophet is never respected in his hometown. It's absolutely true. It's I went back there, and one of those incredible journeys. They bless their hearts, they actually called me to a church that was down the road, a church called Timaru Church. Timaru, Oamaru, Meraki, Boulders, if some of you are familiar with the geographical location of the South Island. And so, here's the funny thing. This is God's sense of humor at play. I grew up in a very musical family. We had, Heta would know this, our family had a singing group called the New Generation Singers, and we toured all around just doing music. Our idols were the heritage singers, and we wanted to be like them so much and do that kind of ministry. So we did. I can remember going to Timaru Church, and it's just country church. And I can remember singing there and walking out and saying to myself, boy, I pity the pastor that has to pastor this church and has to live out here. In the first place God calls me when I graduate from Avondale College is to that very spot. And I had to stand there, and in my first sermon, I shared that story with them, and of course, they just all cracked up. My first sermon. I've since had to write back to the church and apologize for those first sermons as a rookie pastor, asking for forgiveness because you're still just learning. And aren't we all doing that? We're always learning. I don't know, because if any one of you have got the leadership thing together or you've got the church thing together, please let me know. But we're all learning. We're all in this journey together, and we want to be the best version that we can be of ourselves for God in raising His kingdom. And so not long after I was ordained into the gospel ministry, they called me to South Australia, Becky and myself and Rachel. Our daughter was born in Timaru, and we worked in the youth department there in South Australia. Then they called us back to New Zealand doing a similar thing in family and youth ministry. And now, in the current present time, I work in Gilson College. It's the flagship of our education here in Australia. It's the biggest college. We're over 1,100 students at the moment. And we crunched the numbers not long ago. It was just over 10% were Adventist within that 1,100. So I like to say that I actually have the biggest church in our conference, because when prize givings and many of the other things, when they come together, I have about 2,500, 3,000 people in the auditorium that we get to minister to, that we get to interact with, that we get to be community with. And absolutely exciting time, scary, but challenging as well. But there's nothing that we cannot do, because God is on our side. He's called you. He's called me for a very specific task, and He's called you for a very specific task. And if you doubt that, then you and me need to get down on our knees and keep praying. Doubt's okay, but place your doubt in Jesus Christ and watch that doubt dissipate. Watch it disappear as you are affirmed again in Scripture. So that's a little bit of our journey so far. I wanted you to know that, because it's the worst thing is, I don't know, I've been in some of these seminars many times, and I'm like, who is that guy up the front talking, and what's his journey been like? But I'd have to say, in the churches that I've journeyed through, I have seen that we have often missed the boat in how to do community well. And yet, it is most probably what anchors God's calling to all of us. It is most probably why we are struggling the most in our churches. We have an incredible message. We don't doubt that. But how we treat one another, how we interact with one another. For some of you, you would know that I'm just completing my doctoral studies in a particular area. The field is in adolescence. how do we work with adolescents, and how does interact? And I'll talk a little bit about this because I hope that your church, we are discussing it often in different quarters, but we keep coming up with programs as an answer to some of the problems that we have. And often we do this in isolation. We do spirituality in isolation of what people are going through and how they're growing, their developmental stages, and especially with young people, adolescents. For instance, children. They're in a dependency phase. We term it, they're dependent on their parents. They move into adolescence. They start to experiment with independence. And I don't know if we have some parents in here, you will know what I'm talking about. When they start pushing against it, they start testing these three main questions that adolescents, that becomes their journey. And that is, who am I? Do the choices I make matter? And do I belong? Three really big questions. And just before we jump into this, those three big questions that adolescents ask are the questions that God answered when his son was baptized. Think about that. Identity, autonomy, belonging. When Jesus was baptized, God said, "This is my son." My son. Claimed him. My identity. Whom I am well pleased. Whom I love. He understood that. And in that sense, brought him into that community of believers. So powerful, that's the kind of stuff we wrestle with. And how does that tie in with spirituality? Because we got to do it here before we fit spirituality into it. See, often what we do is we do spiritual, and all we do is think spiritual. And we never ever look at what's going on for the kids? What's going on for the young people? What's going on for the parents? And how can we connect? For years now, we have said, let's see what the Bible says. But we now, that study in this particular area, what we now do is say, no, let's look at the context. Let's look at what's going on for them. And then let's see how the Bible talks to that context and changes the trajectory of that young person or that child or that parent, or more importantly, that family. I'm going to share a little bit of stuff that we do with our church. Now, it may not work in your church. That's fine. It doesn't. There is no one picture that says this is how it has to be done. But in between our preaching, and in between that, and when we get to discuss life groups, when we do life in the study of the Word, we have groups that unpack the sermon. Then we have groups that unpack the Sabbath school class. One of the reasons why we've gone that direction is because there are people that walk in, and you can imagine this picture. I don't know if it's happened to you, but this is Sabbath school, and John is brand new. And so the three of us, Tanya and Corin, we're right there because we studied our lesson. And we're going for it. And Tanya's giving back. And Corin's jumping in and commenting. But what happens to John? Absolutely lost and feeling like he's been left out of this. And out of the picture completely. But the fact that now we sit and have a sermon, and they get to hear the sermon and are moved by it, we now, if this is the class that gets to unpack that as the facilitator, I have questions that we've all heard the same message. As adults now, we can interact. The kids, the young ones, they run still because they need that kind of structure. But as adults, we can absolutely interact and learn. And we have our Sabbath school classes that are wanting to wrestle with the lesson as well. And that's fine too. But we've grown up in the church that we recycle a lot of those lesson pamphlets right through. And that's fine. But we've got to find somewhere to anchor our people in the Word. We are the people of the book. We are the people of the truth. God became a living truth. He says, I am the way, the truth. Truth isn't a concept. It isn't an idea that we try and chase after. It's a living embodiment. It's a person. It's the Son of God. And so in between those two, we have what we call snack and chat. It's actually a time where we get to eat. It's a time where we get to do community. And there is no way my worship's leaders will get up and say, folks, we're going to have a break now, and then we're going to move into life groups discussion. Folks, we're going to continue to worship as we come together around the meal table. We're going to continue to bring glory and honor to Him. You see, you're starting to shift what we call the story, the narrative, because every church has a narrative. And here's the thing. If you want to change culture, you change the story. If you want to change a culture within a church or any organization, you change the narrative, you change the story. For instance, me arriving at Gilson College, the church was a church really for teachers. So we asked a few questions. We found out what the story was of the church. And we sat down and we said, what's your mission? What's your mission field? What's your target audience? And then when we realized that, I started with all of my leaders changing that story. How? By what we said up the front. We realized that we were now supposed to be a family church for the family community of this family. So suddenly, the rhetoric, the speeches, the talks from my elders, from my leaders, from all of us was this: welcome to the family. Great to have you here as part of our family. I hope you feel like you belong to this family. Welcome. You see how you start to shift that? You start to shift the narrative, rewrite it, and that's how you change culture. In fact, one of the top sociologists and guys that look at this from Harvard reminded us of that. In one of my lectures, made that kind of statement. Said, if you're going to change a culture, change the story. Look at what the devil's done. He's changed the gospel story. You can see it in history. As the story changes, culture changes. You think about your own ethnic cultures, and you see how along the way the stories, I guess, has changed. I guess, if anything, this is why Moses reminded the people of Israel when we came to Deuteronomy 6, the great Shema, where you were told to love God with all your heart and to tell these stories year in, year after to your loved ones, to your little ones. That's the whole point of that, is to keep those stories. Parents, we have an absolute call to that task, to keep those stories flowing, keep reminding them. If you think of the Old Testament story, if you've gone through the Old Testament from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, where the big motifs was the promised land, what I promised you, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, I will fulfill those promises. I will bring them back. Even though I take you through Egypt, even though I bring you out, I will come back and I will fulfill those promises. If it's not with you, Abraham, it's with Isaac. If it's not with you, Isaac, it's with Jacob. And it went all the way to Moses, to Aaron, and then out in the wilderness. And they still didn't get it, what was going on for them. But all through, they were told, tell these stories, tell these miracles, keep them going, remind the children from generation to generation to generation. And we have lost that art. Even in my own culture, we grew up with that. And yet this next generation, we're lazy storytellers. And my parents, they could sit there and talk and share the stories. But this next generation, we've stopped doing that. And so when you go through that, and you go through the stories, and you go through those first 5 books, and finally they're at the door of the promised land, and they take the promised land, they cross over, and they start to divide the land up. But Moses couldn't make it. Joshua now is in charge. And God gives the command to Joshua to remind him again to keep these stories. And generations pass by because none of the generation from Egypt were allowed to make it to the promised land. So the second lot made it in. And then when you hit the book of Judges, you move into a next generation, and the story has started to change. We miss out on so much. Have a look at these couple of questions that I have up there before we just move to the next section. Have a think about it. What is your church doing to be intentional about creating an authentic community within and without? Because community isn't just about looking outward, it's about looking inward as well. And what we do inside, it's taking everyone on this journey. It's part of our DNA. It's who we are. It's how we live life. It's how we were designed to do life like this. There is a yearning in each and every one of us to be loved, to be in community. What do you see are some problems that cause you not to be able to do community well in our churches, in your church specifically? That can be really challenging to ask those of ourselves. But we're at a crossroad. We're at a point where people need to work, they need to hear. They need to belong. They need to come into a community. I have a study that I shared with the teachers at Gilson about the ever-growing percentages of people in Australia who are experiencing loneliness. It is huge. Have you ever done a demographic study of your neighbourhood? I have. Every census afterwards, I've looked at the shifts and what's going on for my community. And from 2000 right through to the latest survey census, our growing demographic is in single parents. It has just jumped up dramatically. And you can bet your bottom dollar that they are experiencing loneliness. In fact, they indicate it. So how do we address that? As a community, if we do community well, we have a great opportunity to bring hope and love into. People aren't going to walk into your churches. They absolutely aren't going to say, you know what, it's a great day. I think that those bunch of people that dress up on Sabbath morning, I'm just going to go in there and hang with them. There's some questions that and Peter and I have sat and laughed and wrestled about this. We've asked certain questions, and we have this uncanny moments where we will cane ourselves. We will be brutally honest. And that's not dissing the church, because I love our church. But if you want to be the best version of yourself, don't be afraid. to say, what are we doing right? What could we do better? And how do we do that? And one of the things is, what is it that you have that you think that people out there cannot possibly live without? It's a tough question. What is it that you have in your church that people out in the world that we think that they just cannot live without? It's a tough question to ask, and we can't just simply come up and say, oh, we have Jesus. Because people will say, who is that? And what's he going to do for me? My husband left me, took one child, left the other child, and now I'm fending. How does Jesus help me? These are the kind of conversations we will have with people. My family has deserted me. Our Grace Connection team would know people who have been left homeless, who understand that issue, that are needing shelter, are needing food, how we connect with those folks in terms of helping them see that there is a community that care for them and a community that they can belong to. Think about those questions because we don't have time to discuss it. What are some practical ways your church can do community-wise? Let me share from our perspective these three things. Intergenerational church. Gilson College Community Church operates on an intergenerational church. Some people have said, but you grew up doing that as islanders. You know, you involved everyone and you got everyone. We didn't do intergenerational ministry at all. Because what we did was, when it came time for 13 Sabbath, it was the children's show for us as parents. That's not intergenerational ministry. Intergenerational ministry says this, that, and I'll use Pastor again, Tuaoi. He's a young person that's just walked into the church. Intergenerational ministry says, I will go along, I will take his hand, and I will walk with him. And together we will talk. Together we will learn how to do this faith thing together. And I will pour into him, and he will pour into me. And if we have a 13 Sabbath school program, it's not just going to be him doing the memory verse. It's going to be me and him. That's intergenerational ministry. When we work together, if we're going to go and clean up someone's yard, it's not, hey, it's great to see our young people rally together and going and cleaning up the yard, and yet the adults just sit around. Intergenerational ministry says, you know what, as Jesus did, I'll walk with you, I'll talk with you, I'll weed with you, I'll mow the lawns with you. Together we do this. And together, God can bless me and bless you through me, and I can be blessed through you, because none of us have a monopoly on God's blessings. That's intergenerational ministry. We have our children help take the offering. They feel like they belong. They do it with the adults. So we have one adult, one young person, one child. They get to work together. We have so much worked on structure. Now, really quickly, let me show you what I think happens to us. You come up with a brilliant idea. So think about the idea of your church. What's the idea that your church rallies around? Is it to spread the gospel in your community? So that's the idea. So you come together with a group of people, and that's your idea. How do you make that idea work? What do you do? In order to make an idea fly, you then put structure to the idea, don't you? You put wheels on it in order for the idea to move. And so you give it structure. Okay, so the idea is we're going to help the needy people in this community. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to get some food, and we're going to get a team that's going to go and serve their particular, maintenance around the home and that. Okay, so you're starting to put structure into it. And then what happens is that works really well. What do we end up doing? What we end up doing is we then institutionalize that idea. It's what we did with church. We want to take the gospel. We set up structure so that we can do community in the form of church services and all that stuff. And then we turned it into an institution. And suddenly, the idea feeds the institution rather than the structure and the institution feeding the idea. It's called the organic cycle. Because once you put structure, I would come back to that structure in 6 months' time or a year later, and I'd say, is this structure still working for us? Is it still feeding the idea? Is it still growing the idea? And if it isn't, scrap it. Get back down on your knees and say, Lord, where is your will in this now? We are building and moving a movement, not building a monument. But I believe we have built a monument and we've stopped moving. God's work is a movement. We're sojourners. We're not just, you know what, when we talk about types and antitypes, the whole journey of Israel was a type. And when they were in the wilderness, we are in that very journey as well. And we are waiting for the promised land. They were going through that same thing. This was not their home. The promised land was their home. This is not our home. Like the good old chorus, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. Treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. It's just something that, when you think about that, challenge yourself to ponder on that. How do I make sure that what we're doing continues to feed the objective or the idea? And if you don't know what the idea is, sit down with your leaders, sit down with your church, sit down with your members, get your pastor on board. And if they won't come on board and you want me to come and punch them, that's fine. I can do that too. We can help sort that out. But you've got to find a way to sit and work out, what do we do? How do we best serve the goal, the objective, the idea, and keep evaluating it. And if you don't have that clear, then I would suggest that as a community, you need that. You need to be very clear in what you're doing. And if it's just to come together on a Sabbath morning so that people can get their fix for a spiritual message, then I'm absolutely sad for us. Because that's not what community and church is about. It's a blessing that we get. But boy, the blessing is when I get to give within the community. I've been in youth ministry for a while, and people used to ask me, what do you do to serve the young people? What's your main task? And I used to answer that by saying, my main task is to grow their faith. It's to grow their faith and connect with God. You know what? For years I missed something. And what I missed was this in that equation. And I now answer it this way. My main objective is to grow people so that they can live out their faith in community. Because it's in community that my faith is growing. It's in community that my faith is accountable. It's in community where I get to have the encouragement, where I get to be lifted up by a fellow journer on this journey that we're on. Change your story. Build bridges. Here's a. Now, you will be the first to hear this. But Peter Ronfans releasing a new book. It has got the biggest print that the division has ordered. Over 50,000 has been ordered, and even more going right across the SPD. This book that's coming out in August and September. The reason why I'm mentioning it, because here's a practical idea. Somehow we got to shift the way we do things. Somehow we got to find a way. How do we reach the community? And And in a nutshell, the name of this new book is called, If You Can Eat, Go Make Disciples. If you can eat, go make disciples. Now, my people here, we know how to eat. So we should know how to make disciples or do disciples. Here's the thought behind this. Let me take you a little excerpt from the book, and it hasn't even gone to the printers yet. We need an alternative approach to sharing faith that is neither aggressively oppositional, blandly compromising, nor simply graciously accommodating. One that affirms the uniqueness of Jesus, his distinctive message and mission, and the experience we have with him, an approach to sharing that is not tainted with pride, superiority and exclusivity, and that also guards against such attitudes. Do you think it's possible? Well, the alternative is this: eating their food. When you look at the book of Luke, it's a simple thing, but how about your neighbors? How often have you sat with them for a meal? How about that unchurched person, or that Muslim, or that Buddhist that needs to see God through you? If you can eat, you can do discipleship. And we're not trying to simplify that, but we're using the very same model that Jesus used in Luke chapter 10. Imagine this. And I've seen this so often where we sit with people at a cafe. We're having a meal, but we're not thinking, here's an opportunity to do life with them, to pour into them. I am not saying pull out your Bible at that time and say, hey bro, I know you've just ordered that beautiful sandwich that I want half of. But what I'm saying is, there's an opportunity to pour into his life. Where Jesus in the ministry of healing used the steps, he met them where they were. And then he said, come follow me. We've got to meet them there. We've got to go to them. We've got to use that opportunity out connecting with people. If you could turn your families into little units of community makers, it's doable. In my little household, I can do community with the person next door to my right, with my Egyptian neighbor, Nabib, on my left. I can do community easily. And hey, so what? If he brings in a lamb roast as part of the meal, check out what Luke 4:10 says. Go to it and see what the disciples did. Absolutely convinced by it. But they understood this, that if they could eat just like their Savior, they could make disciples. We've got to come up with better ways of doing community. We've got to come up with better techniques on how to do community. Not for the sake of getting our numbers up, but for the sake of allowing them to have that hope. Because in a school of 1,100, I have stood at too many funeral services and seen too many people absolutely distraught because they think this is the end. They need to realize that God's extension of his community on this earth is just a little picture of the kingdom community for eternity. And we want them to be part of that. Really quickly, before we wrap up, let me just share something for the people in church. And we've haven't covered half of the stuff. But inside the church, we've got to learn how to do community. We've got to learn how to live with one another. We've got to learn that that's okay if that person's a Pacific Islander. That's okay if that person's a European, or that person's a South African, or if that person is a South American. That's okay, because they're going to make the kingdom of heaven so much more brighter. So much more brighter. this is what we have found in our studies that is actually one of the biggest things that young people kick up against, is that everything we do in church is an adult model. And you think about what we do. We disenfranchise the family. We move them into Sabbath school, and it's all about that adult moment. You get there, and let's get rid of the kids. Yay, we can study our lesson. We get to interact. You come to the church service, the sacred divine service for an hour, and you get to do that meeting. And how is that designed? Let's give a little moment just for the kids, maybe a few minutes just to give them a little story. But the rest of the time will still be community for the adults. And the kids will eventually get to the point where they are leaving the church now in droves at the age of 18. And it's not because we don't have programs. It's not because we don't have anything for them. It's because they never felt like they belonged in the beginning. They never felt like they were part of this church because we were too busy doing adult stuff. And that's what, and it's challenging. I absolutely get that. It's challenging for me too. But you know what? I'm so over that now. I don't care if I'm going to be challenged. God has given me the responsibility to work, to build his kingdom. And I will try anything in order to bring that hope, to bring the saving grace of Jesus into their lives. And if that means that I got to do church in a way that encompasses everyone, that allows them to feel part of it, so be it. Let's do it. I'm prepared. But it's such a crucial part. We call it lack of social capital. The biggest thing that young people are not experiencing is that adults are not pouring into the life of the children. And we almost don't have time for them. And so what we do is we use them as tokens, and that eventually that they will grow up and they will get it. Boy, if we want to get them to experience Christ, we got to be serious at working with them. We got to look at the way we do community, meaning how we do church, if that's the language you're used to, and how we do that better to reflect this is a space that allows you to come and serve. I have to be honest with you. Some people say, yeah, we need to give the young people the keys. No, I don't subscribe to that. Because I wouldn't give my child a key to the house on their own or a key to the car. They're just not ready to handle it. But I'll open the door. I'll always open the door and make sure that they feel like this is a place where they can belong. And together we will walk through that door. And whenever they need it, I will help them open it. I will help them unlock it. I will help them change, fit into that space. That's what our young people, and I haven't had time to go through, and maybe one day we'll get the chance to share some of the stuff that we look at from our own studies for young people and what they're wrestling from. But here's most probably the greatest thing, and I'll wrap up because time's done, Darren. I'll wrap up with this. 1 Kings chapter 17. You remember the story of the widow? The widow that's there? And the widow is, she's got just a little bit of oil left and a little bit of flour, and she's cooking the worst meal, the meal that she will end up dying. She goes out and she gathers up stick to come in and start the fire. And you know what she does? While she's out there, because the land is in a famine, Elijah comes along, and Elijah says to her, hey, could you just get me a glass of water? Famine. Now, any person that's local would understand that we're in a famine. There's nothing available. But he says, can you give me a glass of water? And while you're at it, can you just get me a loaf of bread? Well, she turns around and she says, I haven't even cooked anything. And in her response, she's really saying, I don't have enough. I don't even have enough for me and my son. In fact, I'm going to cook this meal. And then she says, I'm going to die. Have you ever been in that situation where someone has walked in and you've just lost your job, but they just need a little bit more money. You've lost your role, or you've lost, you don't have enough time, but they just need a little bit more time from you. They just need a little bit more money from you. They just need a little bit more of your resources in order for them to carry on. What do? I'm cutting this down really short in order to fit this in. Here's what I think those two lived out of. They lived out of two mindsets that we wrestle with today. That is, you live from a mindset that there is not enough. The widower looked, she weighed up what was in front of her, the flour, the oil, and she lived from that mindset that there wasn't enough. Elijah lived from a mindset that there is sufficient. That there is sufficient. Get me a glass of water and give me a loaf of bread. What did she choose? If she had gone home and cooked that meal and ignored Elijah, that story wouldn't be in the Bible, I reckon. The fact that she chose Elijah's invitation and believed that there is sufficient. She chose right. Why? Because in verse 8 of that, it tells you why. Elijah operated from a better source of information. Elijah operated from the perspective that God said, go. I've provided a widow that's going to cook you a meal. Better information. We have that better information provided. What are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to continue to operate from there's not enough? Because there's not enough of us to do community. There's not enough of us to do well. There's not enough money. There's not enough resource. Or are you going to choose the other mindset that there is sufficient because God had said so? And in that, I would suggest that generosity within community builds faith. Generosity in community builds faith, and it helps you to grow. It builds your heart. I live with my wife and our mother-in-law. We lost our father-in-law last year, and she lives with us. When I first came across my mother-in-law, I had to she's not giving away stuff again. She would constantly, people would come to her house, and when they left, she would go to the pantry, she would grab food out, and she would give it to them. And I said, no, we don't have enough to replenish that. And she would give it away. She'd keep giving it away. She is an absolutely generous person. I don't want to see any of you come to my house, by the way. Anyway, for that, no, I'm kidding. She is just generous in that way. And yet I see God fill that jar of flour and oil and keep it full all the time. That's how we do community. Understanding that, we may be down in numbers, down in resources, but it's biblical. It's a biblical mandate. That if we're going to be true to the Trinity, if we're going to be true to the Bible teachings, then let's do community. Let's do it well. And let's remember the new command, that the best way to do it is to love them with all your heart. Love them unconditional. Don't place any conditions. Even if it's tradition, get rid of it. If it's going to hurt someone, stop doing it. And you have a responsibility to bring that up with your churches. Stop doing it. Don't let that get in the way. God never prescribed that. He prescribed the new commandment. He says, a new command I give to you, love one another. Let's pray. Father God, it's such an honor to stand and talk with your leaders and servants in this room. You have called us to serve your will and your purpose. And many times we have let you down. Help us to recapture authentic community. Help us to do that inside and out. Help us to build a community that when people walk in, they say, boy, I feel something special in here. I feel a sense of love and I want to belong to this place. Bless these leaders, bless the families that they represent, bless the churches that they serve. And may we help hasten your second coming is my prayer. Let everyone say.